Iris van Herpen, hello. Very nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too.
So you were calling in from Amsterdam, is that right?
Yeah, I'm in the atelier right now.
I can
In
see that.
yeah, yeah. This is my space where most of the little experiments happen. So before we actually start on a collection, it starts really with little tests on materials and trying to merge different techniques. And it's a very open and free process, but it's one of the parts of the collection I enjoy most. And that's all happening here.
So a
Yeah,
free space of experimentation, really. Yeah.
exactly. Without really knowing where to go yet, I really need that free space in the beginning
Yeah.
without too much definition or control on the design process.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, what has it been like for you in the atelier this year? Because of course there's been so much disruption. So what has 2020 meant for your creative process?
Um, my process is already quite chaotic in its nature, but obviously the last months have been even more chaotic than usual. Mostly because a lot of the partners we work with, a lot of the collaborations, which are so key to my world and my way of thinking, were quite impossible because a lot of the studios were closed on their end. Our own studio couldn't be together. And also in terms of materials, a lot of the companies we developed the materials with were closed as well. So we really had to dance around our usual process and to be very flexible in I guess the speed of creation. We are used to doing a new collection each half year, which is pretty full on. I know that in fashion it's very normal, but with our level of experiment and innovation, it's already really tight to create a collection. And yeah, COVID just challenged that time frame even more. So now we are working towards the January show, and yeah, we just couldn't create as much as we would normally do. We
Mhm.
just had to surrender and accept that life was a little different. Yeah.
Well, I suppose in a way you're a kind of specialist in managing chaos, though. I,
Mm.
I've seen
Yeah,
in
but
your
there's a certain level of chaos that even I cannot cannot manage. But I think we worked through it, and ultimately there's always a way. And I think for what we could do, we did a lot. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Have you found that the pandemic has actually affected the tone or mood of your work at all?
Yeah, I think so. For example, normally we would have a one-way show in the beginning of July in Paris, and this time we couldn't do that, so we did a smaller presentation, which was online, which was very collaboratively focused, much more local focused, and it was much more about planting a seed and doing research for some elements that we are focused on already for a longer period, but I wanted to deep dive into it more, like the sustainability aspects of the materials that we work with. We do a lot of experiments and research to improve on that end, but the last month we could focus more on that, so we started up new partnerships there, which I'm quite excited by. And so I think generally if I look at the designs and the work that grew over the last months, it sort of went deeper into the core elements that are important for me, like the collaborations, the sustainability, and also the femininity aspect of my work, which I just wanted to express even more deeply within my latest design. So I think those elements that have always been important to me became even more important. So it really gave me the time to learn a little bit again about who I am and where I want to go to. I think there was really this time of going introvert and looking inside again, like which is not always natural when you're in a certain speed. So it felt, in a way, it felt like a special moment where I could really reevaluate where I am and where I want to go to. Yeah.
Mm. I guess for so many people around the world, it's been a time to rethink fundamental assumptions. So that's very
Yeah.
interesting that you've been
Yeah.
going through that process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I choose to go within the couture side of fashion, like the art side of fashion, very consciously. Because I already felt for a long time that the whole system of the ready-to-wear, like the pre-production side of fashion, does need rethinking. So it felt actually the last months as well that I could dive into the making aspect of fashion more. Like what structure would make sense for the future of fashion in terms of materiality and production. And that is an ongoing question that doesn't have one answer, but I definitely feel that um, the very simple system of couture, which is a very personal bond between the artist and the consumer, so to say, I think is a very beautiful system, and is, I think, a good source of inspiration to look at again as fashion as a whole, if that makes sense. So I really feel that there is a possibility of closing the gap between the systems of couture and ready-to-wear. And I think the last months have been ground for some really good conversations between different designers, and that also doesn't happen so often.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I feel very positive on that side as well. Yeah.
That's fascinating too to hear, Iris, because I think many people share that sense that fashion is an industry in crisis, at least in the
Mhm.
short term, because of the
Exactly.
impact of this situation.
Yeah.
And in addition to closing the gap between ready to wear and couture, I suppose that suggestion that the future of fashion may lie in its historical roots in bespoke handmade garments and a kind of one-to-one face-to-face contact, that suggests also that there's a kind of connection between the deep past and the deep future that you're thinking through, which to me seems like a very long-standing theme in your work.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. In my work, I'm always looking for dualities within the way I make things, but also obviously the philosophy behind it. And there's a beauty when like technology and craftsmanship can be merged. And I think that same merge can happen very beautifully within the system at large. Because I really believe that we're gonna need some new tools to be able to um, create custom on a larger scale, because obviously the way couture is made is not necessarily scalable for a lot of people, but I actually believe that technology can be this beautiful bridge between couture and the future of fashion. And I really don't think we need to look at the system of pre-production the way we know it today within the ready-to-wear. So I really think technology in combination with the origin of couture can be an inspiration to fill the gap, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there also, in addition to the sustainability issue, is there also an ethical dimension to that? Because the efficiency in pre-production that we often see in fast fashion and ready
Yeah.
to wear, of course, leads to very exploitative conditions for the workers that are making the garments.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
the technologically enabled reinvestment in craft, aiming towards a kinds of mass customization that you're
Yeah.
describing,
Yeah.
that sounds to me like at least could have ethical benefits as well. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And also on the aspect of waste, obviously the pre-production system creates a huge amount of waste in every cycle. I don't know the exact numbers, but they say it's more than half of everything that is being produced is actually not even being sold. So that that can really be solved as well when the newer technologies can help customization, basically, because then we can really produce on demand and still produce on a larger scale. So I mean, these are conversations that are very important and obviously won't change the industry overnight. But there are a lot of conversations going now, and it's very important because somehow I think the industry of fashion is very separated. Brands don't really collaborate together, and I think that's a really important step to make. That within obviously the industry, people are gonna have to collaborate, but we also gonna have to collaborate on a larger scale and to find knowledge outside of our own industry. And I really believe the industries like architecture, but even science and biology can really help improve the making process of fashion. And I just hope that people will, create a more collaborative spirit within the next 10 or 20 years, I would say. Yeah.
Well, that leads us to the main theme of our conversation, in fact,
Yeah.
which is collaboration. And we're going to be looking at 4 in particular of many others that you've undertaken. Just one last question before we plunge into the images of those, which is fantastic to see. I just wanted to ask you maybe a personal question about why you collaborate and how it feels, because I would think that on the one hand, there must be a very intense learning curve for you when you step into these other worlds of creativity and knowledge. And I wonder whether, frankly, you actually feel some apprehension when that happens, or if you just have some inherent sense of mad courage. Partly the reason I ask is that I think a lot of people listening to what you just said about collaboration as a necessary part of the future picture of fashion and other design fields might think, well, that sounds great, but it also sounds quite scary because I'm going out of my comfort zone by definition. So I wonder how you navigate that just on a personal level.
Yeah, I think it's about taking small steps. I think the amount of collaborations within different fields that we do today were quite unthinkable within my first years of having my studio. My mind would not have been ready for that at that time because it's not always, like you say, like super easy to dive into a different world. It takes time. So it's really about taking small steps and to ultimately, when I create a collection, I really approach it as a study, like a study on the short term. Like I have 6 months for a collection, and I really want to learn something within those 6 months. I'm not only focused on creating. I think it's a dialogue between giving and taking, and I don't feel enriched when I haven't learned something within my process. So that's why I guess I have to step outside of my comfort zone. But I remember, like, my first collaborations, that would be one collaboration with an architect. So I really could learn on the 3D printing and experiment there, and also realizing that a lot of time within collaboration is not necessarily effective. You shouldn't focus too much on an outcome, because then I think the value of the process itself is gone. I think a collaboration is really a journey where two disciplines get closer together, and often they are slow processes, which is the opposite of fashion as we know it today. So it really helped me to not focus too much on an outcome, but really to focus on the process itself. And I think that is a very different mindset than a lot of people have within fashion. Like within science, it's natural for everyone to focus on gaining knowledge and to grow together and to enrich each other on on the level of inspiration and a communal, like a collective intellect, I would say. But within fashion, it's very focused on the outcome and on the product itself. So I think as a fashion designer, it's an interesting shift within your mind to also think in a different way within the process and to be open-minded and not to focus too much on the collection only.
Yeah. So
really
also thinking at different speeds also, and
exactly, yeah.
outside of the context of an individualistic vision.
Yeah, and to really see the value of learning knowledge on different fields, because ultimately being able to combine little elements from different disciplines is, I think, to me the most exciting part of my of what I do. So it's a long journey, and it takes a lot of patience, but I would not have want to take a different route. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's look at some examples then, with all that in mind. And as I said, we have 4 to look at. First, just to remind the viewers that, of course, you don't only do collaborations, you also have your own atelier practice, and you're doing this biannual series of collections. This is one of the most recent, which is Sensory Seas, 2020. So just to say that's always going on as you're doing all these other things, and there's a lot of, I suppose, cross-pollination happening between the collaborations and what's happening in your studio practice.
Exactly, yeah, and it's really mixed, to be honest. Like often we do collaborations for the collection itself, but then we obviously also do a lot of collaborations around the collections, but they always influence each other. I cannot really see them as separate, because obviously it's all happening within my studio and within my mind. So the collaborations we do outside of the collections are actually sort of translated into the process of the collection itself. So it's a beautiful dialogue, I think, between the fashion side of things and the expression of art, I would say.
Well, that's a sort of perfect segue to our first example, which indeed plunged you into the I suppose headspace and creative space of another artist, David Altmejd. And you also worked on this project with the extraordinary photographer Tim Walker, and created these images which are stunning to behold and almost difficult to wrap your mind around when you first see them. It's hard to know even what you're looking at, how much is analog, how much is digital. And to me, they also seem like great examples of the futurist quality of your practice. And so that is one thing that I wanted to ask you about, the question of the body in relation to technology, ideas of the cyborg, perhaps, or the digitalization of the body, and whether those ideas might have had something to do with this collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. The work of David Altmejd has inspired me for many years already, and he has a very experimental approach towards the body, which I have as well. And I have a background in dance, And I think that has been the groundwork, I would say, for learning more about my own body and the transformative aspects of my own body, and also I think the control between our minds and our bodies. And those elements are a continuous inspiration for all of the designs I make, I think. And it's, I think, a focus not only about the garment and the body, but also the space around it. And that is obviously very beautifully explored within dance, but in combination with fashion and art, it sort of becomes a new world, which I think is very present here. And the element of nature and growth is very apparent within my own designs, but also within the work of David. And it's always looking at growth, but also on like construction and deconstruction, I would say. And I think this image is really showing first the body from different perspectives. Like it's actually a dancer that was 3D scanned, and he took different seconds within her motion. So the movement that you see here is actually real, a realistic motion that the dancer in his studio actually made. But then he dissected it into different seconds, and that's also something that I did for my Syntopia collection, is trying to dissect the movement of the body into different seconds. And nothing that you see on this image is actually digitally created. So it's really a physical sculpture with the model in it. And I think it's very beautiful that you don't really see a beginning and an end, and that quality of infinity within growth and movement, and the infinity of the transformation that we are always in and that we are always creating ourselves, I think is very beautifully presented in this piece.
Yeah.
So it's really nature deforming itself into a new hybrid. And yeah, I think that's what we are constantly doing within our own minds. And I think it's it's a never-ending fascination within my own work to look for that hybrid. For that hybrid.
Yeah. We can see in some of the other images too, and this one is a great example because we have both the image and a process shot to show how it was taken. So you have, I suppose you could say, you have layering in both time and space, and they're kind of fused together, but also in a way that's non-sequential. So it's not like, I don't know, Duchamp's nude descending the staircase where it's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in a kind of linear series. No. It's a kind of compression of time into a purely conceptual space. Yeah. So here's the image, and here's a shot of it being taken, which kind of helps you understand what you're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's
One more example of this, and this strikes me as a slightly different aspect of the collaboration.
Yeah, I think what is very beautiful here is that the sculpture that David made is actually a dancer. You can see that in the detail of the ballet shoe in the top. And to me, this sculpture is sculpting itself. And I think that's what dancers always do. They are living sculptures. And that's why this image is actually pretty important to me as an expression of what fascinates me and who I am and what I create for. It's really that interaction between arts dance and fashion, and I think it's all coming together in this image. And I think fashion is a very beautiful medium in how we are recreating ourselves always and our identities, and how fluid that creative process is within our identities. And it's becoming more and more fluid nowadays with obviously the digital tools we have available. And I think that's very present in this image.
So are you partly referring there to the idea of a digital avatar, like a character that you assume for a time and then maybe set aside?
Yeah, I think it's even more close to ourselves in the sense that we all have our digital self. We all have created our own online identity. And well, almost almost everyone has, and it's in constant transformation, in the balance between who we want to be or who we want to become, and who we are trying to express that we are. And I think it's a messy process, that self-creation, and I think it's very interestingly shown here on, for example, the hands that the many hands that cover that face, that identity of that sculpture sculpting himself. You see the lines going from his or her, his legs into his chest. That has really been a movement of its own hands that are now, or I guess the arm is gone, but the hands are covering the face. And I think it really shows, I think, the messy side of our self-creation as a process. And,
also very beautiful that it's an image of a kind of duet between two figures, and so it also gives you the sense of how your in real life persona might relate to an imagined digital or otherwise persona.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, this is a great segue to our next collaboration, which is indeed in the domain of dance, and this is very much a collaboration with Damien Jalet, but not only the two of you, because also I understand Marina Abramovich, the great performance artist, was involved, as well as Sidi Larbi Cherakai, choreographer. So this is all, these images are all showing us this extraordinary performance that was based on the opera Pelléas et Melisande in 2018, and it was at the Antwerp-based Opera Vlaanderen, so the Flemish opera. So this is a sort of multi-authored, complex collaboration then. And I wonder if you could talk about your role and how you worked with these other extraordinary creative minds in realizing it.
Yeah, the collaboration was very fluid and very special in that sense, is that often when you work on a piece like this, it's very defined in what every artist is doing. But this specific process was really, really collaborative, and it was really about having conversations together on the vision and where we wanted to take it. And what Marina was very strong about, and Damien as well, and Sidi, is to bring the opera really into a new light and into a new time, so to say. This was really about bringing the story of Melisande into the future, and it was really a time travel piece. And I think we all felt very strongly about that, and it's not easy to bring such a timeless story and a story that people are so well known to into a new jacket or into a time that is unknown. But that familiarity was, I think, the challenge that we were all looking for. And it really felt like my my personal challenge to translate that into obviously the garments that they were wearing, but also to create a connection between the garments and the dance itself, and to really extend the space that the dancers were creating. So it's really bringing the sensory system, so to say, of the dancers into the space of the opera, and to connect the dancers also to the singers, because that obviously is a very close relationship on stage, but can quickly become disjointed because there are different disciplines. And I mean, in my own personal work, we just talked about it. It's so important to try to fill up those gaps between the disciplines, and I think that's what I really wanted to do within my role of this performance as well.
Mm-hmm. So, did you feel that your costumes, in some way, made a kind of physical and conceptual linkage between the core of ballet dancers and the singers as these two populations on stage, like a kind of connective tissue between them?
Yeah, that was really the aim, to really create that visual language between them. And if you go one image back, I think it is also a very good example of, for example, in the middle you see the singer, and he is in direct physical interaction with the dancers. They are actually sharing the same tension, so to say. And we actually hoped in the opera that indeed the singers would become part of the choreography, and they were actually doing that. And that is not very easy, obviously, because they are focusing on the singing, and every movement or interaction can influence the singing, of course. But we were super lucky with the cast, and they were actually becoming part of the choreography in a very physical way. And I think that's something I have not witnessed before or seen in the way it was done here. So that was very, very special. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about that, if I can just move on to some other images so people get a sense of the unfolding performance. I was going to ask you about the relationship to the cast, because I've known other stage costume designers and theater and film costume designers as well. Yeah. And they often talk about the magical moment when the cast member puts on the garment and in a way becomes that other person, even in the dressing room. And there's an incredible moment of transformation. Yeah. And I suppose also here you're dealing with people who have highly trained, very special bodies, or other kinds of physical requirements, as you were just saying with the singers. And I wonder what it was like to work with those very different bodies as opposed to, let's say, runway models.
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, there were no big differences, because the cast, the singers, were so open-minded towards my work. I didn't feel constrained. I actually felt very inspired by their energy and their willingness to really integrate the disciplines together. So yeah, I just feel, or I just felt really inspired by that freedom that I got. Yeah,
that's terrific. And did you feel that there was that moment of the garment in a way becoming the character and vice versa, like a convergence between the persona that you had all imagined and the physicality of the constructed clothing?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That was really a strong transformation obviously happening. But what I felt, what was very important, I think, in this process is that the costumes, the design process of it, but also the fittings was done very early in the process. Like often the costume design is sort of dropped in pretty late within the process, so everyone has its vision and its goal, and then you add to that. But then the costumes come onto the general rehearsals quite late on, but then there's not a strong interaction within the choreography anymore, or even within the emotional connection between the people that are expressing these characters and the vision that they are carrying. And so we actually were involved very early on, and the singers and the dancers were from the moment they started rehearsing, but also doing their early experiments, they were already able to wear the things I created, and that influenced the choreography again, and vice versa. That made me go back to some of the garments and the drawing table to adjust to their character again. So it was a very fluid interaction between their character, like the character of the singers, but then also obviously the character within the opera, and the character that we envisioned of being time travelers and going away from the traditional side of the story. So it was very powerful. It felt very powerful that we were able to bring it so close together.
Can I just ask you one last question about this project, Iris, which is that you mentioned briefly that you have a background yourself in dance, and may at one point have thought about perhaps becoming a professional dancer. I'm not sure, but I wonder whether that had an effect on the way you approach this, or whether it made it in some way more meaningful or meant different things to you because of that experience.
Yeah, on a personal level, it just gives me a huge amount of energy to come close to the dance process again. Obviously, I'm not a dancer, but I use my background within the process. For example, whenever I design, I don't really sketch on paper. I drape. And that way I can put on the garments myself early on in the process, even before we have actually started the construction of them. So I can relate to the interaction between the garment and the body. And that gives me feedback to actually drape further and to go deeper into the design process. And that's also what happened here. But then with the dancers themselves, like we made early samples, they used them in the rehearsals in the studio, and then I adjusted it. So the design and the construction of it is very in tune with the choreography and the dancers themselves, and that is something that takes quite a bit of collaboration and forward and backwards to get there. And I think it's really because of my background that I want to dive so deep into it, and I really want to feel where they are and where they can go with the costumes, and how the costumes influence the way they dance, because I think that's always a very beautiful dialogue. But yeah, between the designs and the dancers.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear you talking about all these different levels of imaginative projection at once, like the idea of time travel speculatively into the future, and then also the idea of imagining yourself into the dancer's body. So there's a lot of kind of opening up of the mental landscape in the project. You had just mentioned draping as a kind of key part of your design activity, and I know that was also very fundamental to the way that you approached this again, seemingly totally different kind of collaboration,
Yeah.
which led to this amazing building in Leiden, which is an extension to the Naturalis Museum, the Natural History Museum there in Leiden, which is the Biodiversity Center. And this was a collaboration with Neuteling's Redijk. I guess hope I'm saying
Correct.
sort of right.
Yeah. You did well.
Okay. So an amazing building and really a science museum.
Yeah.
And I know that the frieze, the concrete frieze that was a major leitmotif of your contribution, was very much based on this idea about flows of material that you would experience when draping a garment on a mannequin, and then what you had experienced in looking at stone and other natural materials. So I wonder if you could talk about the exploration here, specifically with regard to materiality.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Architecture obviously is a very different discipline, and almost the opposite within materiality to my work, because I work with fluidity and the softness of fabrics, and everything I do is through draping, like the sculpting on a mannequin within movement. And I had a moment to wrap my head around the architecture project in how I could bring that aspect of movement and softness into stone. So I really felt inspired by the archive of the Naturalis, which is millions of amazing objects that all are time capsules, I would say. They have extraordinary fossils in their collections, and they were part of the inspiration of bringing this frieze of time travel as well into the building. So without being literal, obviously. I didn't want to bring the archive directly into the designs, so it's much more inspired by both their archive, but also my own texture and fabric exploration, and trying to cast both of them into stone. And the focus was really to bring that fluidity into the stone, and to really give it a presence of growth and a timelessness within the shapes that are captured. Like, it was important for me to bring a hint of recognition of the archives into it, without actually being able to see anything too prominent into it.
Yeah.
And it was really that balance that I tried to capture. And in a way, it's really a fabric that is sort of strolling inside and outside of the building. Like, it's all the way inside, but it's also all the way outside. So it's in a way, in the end, it became pretty close to the way I drape a dress. And that was, to me, my own challenge, is how can I bring my fascination for movement and growth, but also the softness of my discipline into stone, into architecture. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about how you actually went about fabricating this amazing element for the architecture? Because I suppose, in a way, it's an example of what you talked about at the beginning of our conversation about mass customization, because no one foot of the frieze is exactly the same as any other foot. And I can imagine that producing it must have been a kind of required a lot of innovation in its own right.
Yeah, no, it was it was quite a process. It took a few years to get here. And it's really a combination of craftsmanship and technology. I think, like a lot of my own work is as well. And the molds are carved by a machine, but then the process of the stone pouring the concrete that is mixed with the stone is actually done by hand again. And they really needed each other. And then the hard part for me is that obviously I could drape little details, which I actually did in fabric, but then I had to translate them into 3D models. So first I did draping, the draping process, and then I started resketching all of the draping. And then we had to blow it up, obviously in the right sizes, and it's hundreds of meters of these fossil designs, and it's all different. So but I think the aspect of not having a repetition to the eye was really, really important to me, because I really wanted the nature to be present. And I think that's so beautiful when you slice a mountain or a rock formation that has been growing over millions of years. Like, there is not one section that is the same, and it really felt like this building also had to be like a sliced mountain, where time has been on pressure, so to say, and you just see thousands of years going by. And that's the energy I try to capture within these layers.
I love the idea that nature is the original mass customization process.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. But also the sense that fashion is this very quick thing, like you say, twice a year, and then here you have the deep time, the incredibly expansive time scale of geology, and those two things speaking to one another. It's also maybe worth saying, I think a lot of people know this about you, but of course you became famous for being the first person to send models down a runway in 3D printed dresses. So in addition to the maybe more obvious thing about draped garments speaking to geology and natural form, there's also another maybe deeper resonance here between your own specific way of making garments and your way of making architecture.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that. I think it is definitely influencing each other.
So it's just a great example of how you can go into a totally different field but take a lot of yourself with you,
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's turn to our last collaboration, and this is actually going back a few years, because as I understand it, your residency at CERN, which of course is the Hadron Super Collider, the famous scientific particle physics research facility, that was actually all the way back in 2014. And then, as we'll see, you created a series of garments based on your experiences there in 2015 that were called Magnetic Motions, which we'll see in just a second. But I thought we would finish with it, partly because in some ways it is the very most mind-blowing thing that you've done, and maybe also presents the greatest apparent distance between your own expertise and the scale of your practice and the world that you were going into. Geez, what can you say about going to CERN and what that was like?
CERN, to me, it's one of the most magical places on this planet. It literally blows your mind. Not symbolically spoken. It really blows your mind. And the level of inspiration I felt while visiting this place is really beyond I could imagine beforehand. And on different levels, it has been really, really inspiring. on one hand, standing in front of the Large Hadron Collider, which is actually not this experiment because this is antimatter, but there is maybe a different.
This image.
Yeah, I mean, this is a part of the Large Hadron Collider, and I was amazed by the level of craftsmanship that was actually in here.
Yeah.
It's hard to grasp on an image like this, but it's like a huge tapestry of science. It's thousands of wires, which you can really look at as a fabric. That are hand assembled into this machine, and to me it was really extraordinary the amount of craftsmanship was involved in building this machine. And what I also found really beautiful as an energy at visiting CERN was the level of collaboration. Like, we talked about collaboration earlier on, and of course I collaborate with different people, but the way CERN collaborates, that is another level of collaboration. That's 10,000 of scientists from all over the world collaborating together for a higher cause, and that is something we all, even as a human species, can learn from, like the collaborative mindset of science, and really needing each other to create. That really struck me as well. And I also felt like it was a really beautiful example of collaborating with nature. Obviously, nature is involved in different scales, but I focused on one element to translate into the magnetic motion the collection, and that was the magnetic field that they're recreating.
Actually, let me go ahead to just a couple of examples of the garments so people know what you mean.
Yeah. So I collaborated with an artist called Jolande van der Wiel, who uses magnetic force to create textures. So we collaborated together on this collection to really embed nature as a collaborator into the collection. So obviously magnetic the power of magnets is a natural power, and using the magnets to grow the textures was really a different way to control craftsmanship, I would say. We were really depending on the decisions that were made by a different force, so to say, and that has been very inspiring to me. And I've done it in different ways in different collections, but obviously generally in my work I'm a control freak. I want to design every little millimeter within the garment. A good example here as well, which is 3D printed, and then you have to literally design every millimeter, but using the magnets to grow some of the textures was really about letting go of this ultimate control. And I think it sort of has been an exercise to me to not only take nature as an inspiration, but to look at nature more and more as a collaborator within my process. And that is still an ongoing process within my work today. So and CERN really has been the beginning of that, I think.
So that's fascinating with respect to the idea of chaos that we spoke about earlier, because in a way you might think that chaos and authorship, or even control of the physical qualities of the garment, that those two things are opposites. But it's like you've found a way to get them together into one project. So on the one hand, the radical unpredictability of what a magnetic field will do to materials, which you could never imagine or forecast or plan.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, these garments look so much like Iris van Herpen garments. You know, they're so much a part of your language. And I think it's very awe-inspiring to think about the way that you can take the particularity of your individual vision and the sublime, infinite kind of force of something like magnetism, and somehow get them into one tiny space. It's really incredible thing.
Indeed, it felt like it feels like opposites in a way, but they are not so far apart as you think once you start once you start opening up for merging the two sides of working. So it really felt it felt like a challenge to change my way of working and to change my way of thinking. And CERN really helped me to, obviously the conversations we had with people there really helped me to understand my own process better. Yeah.
Speaking of nature, you have a furry friend near you.
Yes.
So this is our last image. Can I just ask you one other question about the CERN collaboration? And this is maybe a bit more of a provocative question in some way, but it strikes me that that huge collaboration and that massive tapestry of science that you described, and the thousands of people from all over the globe working together, as I understand it, they're pretty much trying to discover things for the sake of discovering them. In other words, there's not a direct economic implementation to the discovery of a new particle, let's say, but it's really the pursuit of knowledge in a pure way. And it strikes me that when scientists go off and do that, the world generally celebrates it, or, you know, going to the moon, whereas fashion is often critiqued for being some kind of superficial, pointless exercise that leads only to innovation, which is somehow in that context held to be kind of hollow. And it seems to me like your collaboration at CERN also points to the fact that fashion or the garment can be just as valid a space for pure innovation as science. And in fact, those two things aren't very different from one another as well. And I wonder what you think about that argument.
Yeah, no, it's very nice that you mention it. I mean, obviously there is a ton of differences between fashion and science, but I think the way I approach fashion is a lot more fluid than the way we have sort of boxed it within our minds. And I think it's also closer to art in that sense. And I think the beauty to both art and science is that they often question more than that they answer. They create a new space within our minds, and they both challenge us to not be afraid for the unknown, and to in a way to stay young and to keep questioning every little aspect around us, like even the things that seems obvious and that we feel we understand and that we know are being questioned constantly through art and science. And that is a philosophy, I think, that is lost, or perhaps has never existed within fashion. I don't know, but it feels within my own work, it feels important to learn from science, and also to really approach fashion as a form of art where science can become part of its language. And yeah, I really feel it's important to open up that conversation and to give people a wider view or a wider perspective to what fashion can mean to us, what it can do to us, and how it can bring us further into who we are. And I think that's one important lesson that I found discovering when I visited CERN.
It's such a beautiful set of discoveries to make, because of course it also, I'll just stop sharing the PowerPoint now so we can see you a little better. It of course relates not just to fashion, but by implication to design in general as a human activity, and what it can do precisely by virtue of the fact that it's situated in relation to style, to ideas, to art, to science, technology. So as a space for innovation, it can do so much. So that's such a wonderful ending to the conversation, but I'd have a couple of questions also that we had in advance. And one of them actually is very much on the point of collaboration within your practice. And it's whether the collaborations interrupt what you're doing, or whether they in some way help you shape your overall creative journey. So it's a question about sort of pulling back the camera a little bit and thinking about how the collaborations serve as milestones in your overall progress as a designer.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. You are editing this, right?
Well, we always keep the dogs in.
Yeah. No, I think the collaborations actually do both. They are in a way interruptive, but I think that's the value of them. Because I think a creative process is about zooming in and zooming out within your own work. It's very important to zoom in because I think that's the ground work for the craftsmanship and even the technology. Like if you really want to master the execution basically of a design, then it's really about zooming in. And it's a very deep dive into the details, but at the same time, when you want to grow within your vision, when you want to step outside of your own bubble, outside of your own world, to enrich and invite other views, then it's really about zooming out. And it's interesting in a collection process how it really feels like the ebb and flow of a sea, I would say, in the way I consciously zoom in and zoom out. And the collaborations actually really help me to zoom out, and I can otherwise just get lost into my own bubble basically. And obviously it's a beautiful bubble of craftsmanship and new experiments and all that, but to find the balance between the development of a vision and I guess the merge of the different disciplines and worldviews, I would say, into my work, into fashion. It's really important to zoom out at the right time. So I consciously try to balance that flow.
Yeah. It reminds me of that famous film Powers of 10 by Charles and Ray Eames, where the camera goes in and out and you discover that the vastness of the universe looks a lot like the fine detail of the molecular structure. And I really feel a lot of that sense of navigating different scales and contexts in your work, and how much you discover both difference and similarity as you do that. We have time for just one last question, and this is maybe getting a bit more practical in a funny way. So it was just a question about whether the logic that usually happens in couture fashion, that it sort of goes downstream and affects ready-to-wear and affects what you see on the racks in your local store, whether that's something that even applies to you, and whether it happens, and if so, how?
It's a good question. I think my work influences on the materiality side and also on the technique side, like the merge of craftsmanship and technology, and also the way we have opened up the atelier to different types of collaborators. But I don't think it's about creating a direct translation or a copy, like you could name it, because very simply said, I think that the work is just too layered and too complex for that. I think it's a very different world in terms of process of how the couture garments are being made that we do, and obviously the garments that you see in a store. And I guess to me it's also not so much the goal. To me it's so much more important, I think, to relate and to create a dialogue on the larger scale of fashion, rather than the very zoomed in practical side of that garment on the rack that is so time specific. I really look at my discipline, obviously both zoomed in and zoomed out, but on the philosophy side of things. To me it's important to think of what couture means, I think, in the 21st century, and how it can influence the industry on creating a wider view towards fashion. And I think that has more impact than a physical translation of a whip-off or a copy or whatever you want to name it. Yeah.
So it really takes us back all the way to the beginning of the conversation when you were talking about the imperatives of ethical and sustainable transformation of the fashion industry, because in a way what you're trying to do is not influence a specific trend within fashion, but change the way that we're thinking of fashion in general.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is, I just want to say, I feel like that's an easy thing to say, but an incredibly hard thing to do, and to actually deliver on that idea. And I totally feel that you're doing that in lots of different dimensions simultaneously. And I just want to conclude by saying that given how much you accomplish in a given day, I'm very, very grateful to you indeed for spending an hour of one of them with us.
No, it's been an honor to me. It's been such a pleasure to talk together. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Iris. And I'll just let viewers know that our next interview will be next Wednesday, and we'll be talking with the New York artist Daniel Arsham, who interestingly has a lot in common with some of the things you talked about earlier to do with construction and deconstruction, decay and growth creation. So there will be some good connections there. So Iris, best of luck with all the things you're doing later today, design meetings, and have a great weekend as well. I hope you get some rest.
Thanks.
Sometime. Okay. Thanks very much. We'll see you again.
Ciao.
Ciao.